Okay. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to encourage those who are attending our events for the first time and not a member to consider becoming one of our members. Please visit us at dcslovaks.org for more information. I will put the URL into the chat later. Michael Cude is an associate professor of history at Schreiner University, a liberal arts university in Kerrville, Texas, where he is also the program coordinator for the Global Scholars Learning Community. His research specializations, geez, I can speak, are modern Central and Eastern Europe and U.S. diplomatic history. He is the author of several books and academic articles in addition to the Slovak question, including most recently Woodrow Wilson, the First World War and Modern Internationalism. And now I would like to hand over the microphone to Professor Cude. Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thank you, Marta, for the kind introduction, and thanks to you and Helen as well for inviting me to come talk about the book. And so my book on the Slovak question came out a couple of years ago, and Marta already introduced me and where I'm at right now. So a little bit of background on where the book came from. Like the very short version of this is that I was living in East Central Europe, so I traveled around in a variety of places, but I ended up making my way to Slovakia. Really enjoyed it there, really loved it, and later went back to continue study for my doctorate. And I knew I wanted to do something with the region. I had really loved Slovakia, so I decided, well, I'll just kind of like look into seeing what's out there and what opportunities to research on a topic related to Slovakia. And I kind of made my way into U.S. government documents, and then suddenly just found there were all of these bits of correspondence coming from Slovak Americans, so Americans who had immigrated from Slovakia, and like there were lots of these, and I just kind of fell into a rabbit hole and started getting into it, and I spent a bunch of time going in all kinds of directions in the rabbit hole, and then a few years later I popped out with this book. And so it's kind of a result of a project I just kind of stumbled into and just found really interesting, and worked into a book. And so it's an academic history. So if you read it, there's going to be a lot of footnotes, and I get into a lot of detail and specifics on this thing. But if you're a nerd about Slovakia and Slovak history, it might be of interest to you. And so today I'm just going to give kind of a general overview of the book. So we'll just kind of hit some of the highlights of the history that it covers. But overall, the topic is the Slovak question. And, this, you may not be familiar with this term, but especially today, because Slovakia is its own country, we have the Slovak people, nobody really even kind of questions, like, this is a thing, a reality that exists out there. But this actually was something of a question by the early 20th century, especially with the creation of Czechoslovakia, where there were a lot of debates over, like, okay, what's the relationship between the Czechs and the Slovaks? Are they the same people, or are they different people, maybe closely related, but are the Slovaks, should they be treated and viewed as a distinct people? And that's really where this term, the Slovak question, comes from. And this was something that was very, very heavily debated. And ultimately, it kind of got decided in 1993 with the Slovak independence, and so we don't really think of it in the same way today. But really, what my book tries to show, first off, is like, okay, that this was an ongoing debate, and then really the focus, though, is to show that this was a debate that was very, very much including Slovak communities in the United States, and that's really what the book is about, is to show that there's this debate over, like, what does it mean to be a Slovak in Czechoslovakia? What role and what place should they have in former Czechoslovakia? And that this debate was taking place both in Czechoslovakia as well as in the United States. And there's a lot of like back and forth communication between them. And so why do Slovak immigrant communities in the United States play such a role. Really, the big reason is because a very, very large percentage of the Slovak population in the late 1800s, early 1900s immigrated to the United States. And so the numbers are like extremely precise, but we're looking at roughly a quarter to a third of the population of Slovakia at that time immigrated to the United States. And so Slovakia is not a very big country, doesn't have a huge population, but because such a large percentage immigrated over, it kind of gave them a pretty extensive influence. And we're also going to see, and I'll kind of like give hints at this throughout the talk about how they kind of also, there are moments, particularly during the World Wars, where you have, politicians coming from Czechoslovakia to the United States to engage them, along with lots of correspondence going back and forth. To note, though, is that this process doesn't actually get started before Czechoslovakia is created. And if you're familiar with the history, you know Czechoslovakia gets created as a country at the end of World War I. And before that, the Czechs and Slovaks are part of what was at the time the Austria-Hungary. And the Slovaks were part of the Hungarian half of Austria-Hungary. And before World War I, there was a lot of pressure in Hungary for national minority groups to assimilate to Hungarian culture. And because of this, there was a lot of tension that kind of built up during that time period. And this includes Slovaks, but also other national minorities in Hungary. But at least as it relates to the Slovaks, what ends up happening is as large numbers moved to the United States, in many ways, immigrating to the United States became kind of a way for them to start really having more freedom to dive into their national culture because there was less pressure. In a sense, they could come to the United States and there were debates going on, but there was an opportunity to form cultural organizations to really develop, like, okay, the Slovak language, start thinking about what being a Slovak means, the culture. And I had a document that's from 1893 that I think kind of sums it up, the mentality, but this document said that the best way to create a true Slovak was to send them to America, because there they had more opportunities to develop their culture than they did in Hungary at the time. And there's a little bit of hyperbole to this, but that was kind of like the mentality that developed among Slovak American communities at the time. And ultimately, this is going to culminate. Okay. I'm trying to change slides, so give me a second. Okay, there we go. So this is ultimately going to culminate in the early 1900s, particularly in 1907, with a conference held in Cleveland, Ohio. This conference is on May 30th of 1907. That's going to form an organization called the Slovak League of America. And I may refer to it as the SLA. From this point, the Slovak League of America was founded at the time explicitly to be an organization that promoted Slovak national culture. And it was kind of had two parts. It was in part to kind of like maintain Slovak culture among immigrant communities in the United States. So as assimilation to American culture started to take shape, they wanted communities to kind of maintain their Slovak identity. But also it had another role of trying to push for the same thing in Slovakia, to push for recognition and fair treatment of Slovaks in Slovakia, and to push against efforts at assimilation in Slovakia to kind of keep an independent Slovak national identity. And so in my book, the Slovak League of America gets a lot of attention because they're kind of like a main group. They're not the only one, but they're kind of the largest group that's really kind of engaged in this transatlantic national identity program. And ultimately, this will come to a head with the outbreak of World War I. And Slovaks in the United States are, of course, in the United States. The United States is late getting into World War I. So for the most part, they're kind of, there's a sense that they're kind of on the margins, at least early on. But nonetheless, over in Europe, you're going to have the creation of the Czechoslovak movement and the effort to basically break up Austria-Hungary, and as part of this, create a new country, the new country of Czechoslovakia. And this will largely start off as a Czech movement, but pretty quickly into the war, you will see efforts to try to join the Slovaks with the Czechs in order to create a common Czech-Slovak republic. And this organization, of course, if you're familiar with the history, you know it's led by Tomáš Masaryk. So it was the Czech leader, although he also has Slovak heritage too, because his mother was Slovak, so he's mixed nationality. But he also had a few Slovaks working for his operations. The most famous of these is Milan Štefanik. So if you're familiar with this, you know he's kind of like the leading Slovak in the Czechoslovak organization during World War I. But here's the thing, Masaryk and his organization really have a shortage of kind of popular Slovak support that they can turn to, because most of the Slovaks are in Hungary. They're kind of shut off by the war. And so what will happen is Masaryk will look toward the Slovaks in the United States and basically use them as kind of like his popular backbone, to have a group of Slovaks that he hopes to get behind his movement in order to support the creation of Czechoslovakia. And so this is going to lead to another big meeting also in Cleveland, and this will be in October of 1915, where the Slovak League will join with a Czech-American organization called the Bohemian National Alliance, and basically come to terms on an agreement called the Cleveland Agreement, that will be the first formal declaration of common action between the Czechs and Slovaks for the war. So this is literally the first document that says, hey, the Czechs and Slovaks are going to work together to create a common country. Here's the thing with this agreement, though. When it's made, the Slovaks know that they are the minority party in this organization. The Czechs have a larger country, a larger population, and so they're very deliberate in making this agreement to make sure that like kind of the Slovaks are recognized in their own right and in their own way. And so in this agreement, they're going to establish like, hey, the two countries are going to work together toward creating a democratic republic. But also they the Slovaks want to make clear in the agreement that it recognizes an independent Slovak identity. So cultural independence, but also a key part of this is that in a future state, Slovakia would have functional domestic autonomy in the country, meaning that they'd be part of the same country, but think of it almost like different states in the United States, but a Czechoslovakia where there's like a Czech state and a Slovak state, and then they have kind of like a common federal government, but that locally they would each have their own separate governments. And so the Cleveland Agreement, puts this pretty plainly. So here's a direct quote from the agreement. So it establishes that the Slovaks would have, quote, complete national autonomy for Slovakia, including its own parliament, finances, and public administration, as well as, quote, full cultural freedom, particularly the right to use Slovak language as the official language of the state. And so, the big part of this agreement is to make sure that the Slovaks have a voice, that they're not going to be kind of overwhelmed by the Czechs in the relationship. And so they're part of the movement. World War I is going to proceed. The movement to create Czechoslovakia will increasingly gain more international support. And by the time we get to the end of the war, by 1918, it's really starting to take shape. Most of the world leaders, such as President Woodrow Wilson, will come to support the creation of Czechoslovakia. And so as this starts to take shape, you're going to see Masaryk basically making sure to like tie up all the loose ends to make sure there's nothing that can kind of like throw a wrench into the works. And what ends up happening is by this point, you have increasing numbers of Slovaks, particularly Slovaks in the United States, starting to complain about their place in the organization and saying that they're being kind of drowned out, the Czechs are making all the major decisions, and just like insisting that they have more of a voice. And so this is going to lead Masaryk to decide that he needs to kind of like face these complaints head on. And in 1918, he's going to come to the United States. And this trip is primarily about meeting with the US government to make sure that he gets their full support, gets their recognition. But while he's there, he wants to make sure that the US government doesn't start hearing about these complaints from the Slovaks. So he's going to meet with Slovak organizations in the United States and basically try to kind of calm them down and say, okay, get them on board, stop the complaints. And so this will culminate in 1918 in May with Masaryk visiting Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And there he's going to meet with leaders of the Slovak League of America and other organizations. He's going to give a speech where he's going to praise the Slovaks, talk about how essential they are to the creation of the state. He will point out his own Slovak heritage in order to present himself as someone who knows the Slovaks, understands them. And he's going to convince them, like they're going to leave this meeting basically feeling good, feeling like, okay, they've made the right decision, they're on the right track. But they still want to make sure that the Slovaks also want to make sure that their wishes are respected. And so they asked Masaryk for written insurance, like a written document to basically verify that, okay, everything he's saying in his speech is going to be upheld once the new government is created. And so what they're going to do is they're going to ask him to basically recognize the Cleveland Agreement as a formal document guiding the new Czechoslovak Republic that they're working to build. Masaryk takes the Cleveland Agreement. There's lots of things he doesn't like about it, so he's going to take it and basically overnight rewrite it in a much shorter form. And this is going to be what becomes known as the Pittsburgh Agreement. And you can see the image there of the original agreement created in late May or May 30th, 1918. And this is basically just kind of for the most part, it's a general statement just establishing that the Czechs and the Slovaks are going to be working together to create a democratic Czechoslovak Republic. This is going to be a very important document symbolically because it's going to really be a document that's really at the center of the Slovak question moving forward in Czechoslovakia. And there's going to be some controversial parts. One part of controversy is that the Slovak American leaders basically pushed for a line to be included that Masaryk had cut out. And this was a line that said that the Slovaks would be allowed, quote, their own administration, their own parliament, and own courts. And Masaryk didn't really want this in there, but they insist upon it, so he agrees to put this in. And so this is important because this is going to be a line where many Slovaks are going to say, okay, we were promised autonomy in the new republic. But then there's also another line that's going to be controversial on the other end, and this is a line in the document that says that the new government's organization would be, quote, left to the liberated Czechs and Slovaks and to their duly elected representatives. And it's a line that just seems kind of innocuous, but basically Masaryk includes this line so that later he can say, well, you put in the agreement that we were going to determine the terms later, and basically kind of use it as a justification for not including the Pittsburgh Agreement in the later Czechoslovak Constitution. And so these are going to be kind of like the source of like political controversy between the Czechs and Slovaks down the line. But nonetheless, the agreement does what it meant to do. It got the Slovak Americans on board, and they came out in full force in favor of creating the Czechoslovak Republic, which will be achieved at the end By the end of the year 1918, where Czechoslovakia will be recognized by the United States, Britain, France, other major countries. And on November 14th, when Masaryk officially became president of the new republic, he will sign the document as the official head of the new Czechoslovak Republic. And so for the Slovak Americans, they see this as a sign that, okay, he embraces the agreement. Masaryk and they are on kind of the same page about how the Slovaks are going to fit in Czechoslovakia. And so World War I wraps up. We have the creation of a new country, the Czechoslovak Republic. And the Slovaks, on the one hand, particularly the Slovaks in America, are thrilled because they achieved separation from Hungary. They had felt that they were being pressured by the Hungarians to assimilate, and they're going to have a better opportunity now in Czechoslovakia, partnered with the Czechs. They're also going to start feeling frustrated because once Masaryk and the Czech organization have established this new government and start putting it together, building it, creating a constitution, they're increasingly going to start organizing it largely based, firstly, on Czech priorities and kind of giving the Czechs kind of first dibs in the say of the Constitution and how it's structured, how it's treated. And as part of this as part of this development, the documents like the Pittsburgh Agreement are going to be kind of pushed aside and basically no longer treated as, at least by the formal government, as an essential part in framing the new Constitution. And so you're going to start to see a divide take shape. And this is a divide. On the one side, you have the federal government in Czechoslovakia, and they will have some Slovak supporters. These Slovaks will define themselves as centralist because they believe in the idea that the Slovaks and Czechs are a common nation and work more toward kind of blending together as a common nation, and that accordingly they should have a single common government that does not imply a separation between the two. On the other side, you're going to have the Slovak autonomists. These are Slovaks who think, no, the Slovaks are different from the Czechs. These differences should be respected in the new country. And they believe that the best way to do this is to have kind of an autonomous Slovakia as part of the Czechoslovak Republic. And this is going to be kind of the central debate of the Slovak question. It's not just, are the Czechs and Slovaks, like at the core is the question of, are the Czechs and Slovaks the same people or a different people? But then also, how should the government reflect this through should there be an autonomous Slovakia or not? And Masaryk makes it pretty clear not long after he becomes the first formal president. He will make his voice on the he will not mince words on his view of the Pittsburgh Agreement, which he will say, quote, was concluded in order to appease a small Slovak faction which was dreaming of God knows what sort of independence. He says he, quote, had signed the convention unhesitatingly as a local understanding between American Czechs and American Slovaks. And so you can see I kind of mentioned that line in the agreement, like Masaryk will just continually point to that to say, look, this was just something to say how the Slovaks and Czechs in the United States were going to work. It does not shape what we're doing back home in Czechoslovakia. And you're going to see the supporters of centralism in Czechoslovakia become very, very critical of the idea of Slovak autonomy. They will at times refer to as ignorant and not understanding of the realities in Czechoslovakia. In some cases, they will treat it as treasonous, treat them as people who are trying to break up the state that they're trying to form. Likewise, another very common argument they will make is that a strong centralist government is needed because the Slovaks need the extra help. And you're going to see a lot of language and appeals to the idea that the Czechs are kind of like the more developed older brother, and the Slovaks are kind of behind the times. They're mostly peasants. They're not ready to run their own country, and they need the Czechs to kind of like show them the ropes and to bring them along, and that the Czechs are needed to uplift the Slovaks culturally. And these kind of statements are going to be very, very frustrating for Slovak autonomists who very much believe otherwise, and start to see kind of these types of appeals as very condescending, and start pushing for the idea that, okay, in their most critical forms, they start saying that the Czechs aren't any better than the Hungarians were, that they're trying to absorb us, they're trying to force us to assimilate. And what you're going to see is a constant back and forth. And this back and forth is going to be going on in Czechoslovakia, but also in the United States, and then going back and forth across the Atlantic as you have lots and lots of correspondence. And the autonomists will criticize what they call Prague centralism. They will start condemning the centralists as betraying the Slovaks, saying that they had made this agreement, the Pittsburgh Agreement, that they had promised Slovak autonomy, but that they turned their back, and feeling like they had done their part to help create the state. But now they find themselves once again criticizing the government in their ethnic homeland of Slovakia, just because they want, kind of their own identity recognized. And this is these debates are just going to continue back and forth as we move into the period building up to World War II, we now call the interwar period. And this is going to be a lot of flurry of publications, letters back and forth, but also there's going to be lots of travel, where you're going to see Slovak American leaders traveling to Slovakia and Czechoslovakia, as well as Czech and Slovak politicians and other cultural leaders coming to the United States, where they're going to be constantly engaging with these debates. And they're going to start forming factions, where factions for autonomy in Slovakia are going to be coordinating with Slovak American autonomists, and centralists in Czechoslovakia will be coordinating with centralists in the United States. And you see a lot of examples of this. For example, in 1919, the Slovak League will send a delegation to Czechoslovakia to kind of like visit the newly created republic. And they're going to be really frustrated by this visit, because they're going to see like the government that's being formed in Prague is not really talking a whole lot about the Slovaks and Slovak autonomy. A publisher by the name of Josef Hušek, he's one of the more aggressive autonomists at the time. Like he doesn't mince words. He condemns what he quote, the arrogance and domineering attitude of the Czechs. In contrast, he's going to meet Slovak autonomous leaders. Kind of the most notable example of this is a politician and Catholic priest by the name of Andrej Hlinka. So if you know this period in history in Slovakia, you know he's a very, very important a Slovak nationalist and autonomous politician. And Hušek meets Hlinka and loves him. Like this is a direct quote. He says, "Hlinka alone gave me a clear-cut statement. He lived and died for the American Pact," meaning the Pittsburgh Agreement. And so you're going to see the autonomists led by Hlinka, other leaders working with groups in the SLA and other autonomous groups in the United States to basically start pushing for Slovak autonomy. Other visits, you'll have a follow-up visit in 1919 by the president of the Slovak League at the time, Albert Mamate. When he goes, he's really looking to try to bridge divides. He's more of like a figure who's trying to reconcile the differences, find a way to kind of like accommodate both the centralists and the autonomists. And he will meet with the government in Prague. He will meet with Slovak centralist leaders, and they ultimately send him back with a letter that thanks the Slovak Americans, and but then argues that the Slovaks, quote, could neither build up nor maintain its autonomy without Czech help. And so saying straight up, like, sorry, but we're not going to let this happen. And so this just, again, stirs up the controversy. The Slovak League will produce a petition in response that will say, quote, "We are convinced that the honest and upright materialization of the Pittsburgh Act in no way will harm the unity of the state. On the contrary, it will mean a considerable reinforcement within and without and make possible united cooperation." And so this is kind of like how the push and pull went. And for most of, especially the early parts of the Czechoslovak Republic, there was a sense that they're competing, they're disagreeing, but they're still kind of open to compromise. As we move along, though, increasingly, the two sides continue to debate and they start to splinter and increasingly start to disengage. For example, in 1923, kind of the lead Slovak centralist, he's a Slovak social democrat politician by the name of Vavro Šrobar, will go to the United States to basically make the case for centralism. And when he goes, he's invited by the Slovak Sokol, which as an organization supported centralism in the United States. So this is the Slovak Gymnastic Union. This is the American branch of it. And so he's invited, he speaks to them, but other organizations boycott his speeches, like the Slovak League of America boycotts his visit. And like I mentioned earlier, kind of like I got into the rabbit hole of these correspondence and like US government files. Like literally you have both sides like sending letters to anyone and everyone they could in Washington, D.C., either trying to get them to promote this visit or trying to get them to kick Šrobar out of the country. And so we kind of see like how with this visit, how the two sides are increasingly fracturing. This visit will be followed up by a different politician. This will be Hlinka, who will actually visit himself to the United States in 1926. And when he visits, you see the exact same thing, just in reverse. The Czechoslovakist or centralist-minded organizations will refuse to accept him, refuse to let him speak to their organizations, while the autonomous organizations will welcome him with open arms. He will give speeches. He will travel around many parts of the United States. He gives over 200 speeches while in the United States. And he will, just one example of the speech, he praises the Slovaks in America basically as true, authentic Slovaks. And he praises their firm individuality in response to the Slovak question. And then quotes, "A good Slovak who comes to America makes a good American," showing how there very much was a sense that, okay, these are Slovaks who increasingly by this point are assimilating to American culture, but that American culture and Slovak culture are linked. And I think this is also an important thing, is another big theme of the book, is how much the Slovak autonomy movement is influenced by ideas of American democracy, and a lot of comparisons made to kind of like how the United States is structured. The United States is obviously a much bigger country, but the idea of like using the model of the American Republic as a model for Czechoslovakia and for Slovak autonomy becomes a very common argument for Slovak American autonomous. Okay. And so the debate continues, the divides grow, and this is going to start building up to the events leading up to World War II. And you're probably at least fairly familiar with what happens here. But during World War II, you're going to get the splintering of the Czechoslovak Republic. And this starts in 1938 with the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement is then followed up by Nazi Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia, in which Slovakia, which is actually granted autonomy after the Munich Agreement. So you have a Czechoslovakia with, effectively autonomy being put into place. But then when Hitler invades, the autonomous Slovak government then declares independence. So you get the wartime Slovak state. And so in 1938, before all this is happening, you're going to have kind of a big moment in setting the stage. And this is going to be the 20th anniversary of the Pittsburgh Agreement, where you're going to have basically a giant celebration organized in Bratislava to celebrate the Pittsburgh Agreement, which by this point, the Slovaks are still pushing, or Slovak autonomists, excuse me, are still pushing as needing to be put into the Constitution to justify Slovak autonomy. And the Slovak League of America will send an official delegation where they will bring the original copy of the Pittsburgh Agreement. And I have a few pictures of this moment, but you can see this is a massive rally. We don't have exact numbers, but you can see the picture of the crowd. You can see that there's lots of people there. You can see that they made basically a giant facsimile of the Pittsburgh Agreement to have around for people to see and to read. And also, as I mentioned, the Slovak League delegation will bring the original copy of it, and they will show it to Andrej Hlinka. That's what you see in the picture on your left. And then also the SLA president at the time, Peter Hletko, will give a speech where he will praise the agreement, talk about its importance. He will show the crowd. What you see there is Hletko showing the crowd the original of the Pittsburgh Agreement. And basically, you know, it's kind of like a culmination of 2 decades of transatlantic effort by autonomists to promote this goal. And this celebration will then be followed by a centralist celebration. They basically decide they need to hold a counter rally, so they do it 2 days later. The Slovak League also attends this one, and so they were discouraged by the government from heavily promoting autonomy, and so Hletko will give a speech and basically just calls for the two sides to work together and cooperate. Ultimately saying the goal is Slovak freedom and that they're going to continue to work for that. You know, in less than 6 months, though, we're going to have the Munich Agreement. And so, you know, I think this moment is kind of like important for symbolically kind of setting the stage that the autonomy question is still there. It's still in the forefront, and it plays, as I just mentioned earlier, you know, ends up being put into effect after the Munich Agreement. And the reason for that is because the issue was kept alive and continually pushed. But ultimately, the breakup of Czechoslovakia, the Slovak independence, is going to cause even more fractures, as you imagine it would. Like, this is an extremely controversial moment in the history of Czechoslovakia. And you're going to see like the political fissures between the groups get even deeper. And it's also going to become more aggressive in the United States because you're going to have large numbers of exiled politicians from former Czechoslovakia, say former because it was broken up at the time, traveling to the United States and looking for support. And so first off, you're going to have a group that is going to be led by the official government in exile led by President Edvard Beneš, who was the president of Czechoslovakia when it broke up after Munich, before and after. And he's going to form an organization called the Slovak National Alliance, which is a group of Slovaks in the United States who want to recreate the state, they want to recreate the Czechoslovak Republic, but with a firm opposition to any sort of Slovak autonomy. Their goal is to say, look, this, in their view, this Slovak mentality of independence led to the breakup of the state, and they need to put a stop to it. You're going to see another faction organized. Sorry, I forgot to move to the next slide. So here's just the borders of the Slovak Republic during World War II. Another group, though, will form, and this is a group that I kind of in my book refer to as the moderates. And the moderates are basically a group who support the recreation of Czechoslovakia, but this time they want autonomy put in from the start. And they're going to be led by a former Czechoslovak prime minister who is also a Slovak, a leading Slovak politician by the name of Milan Hoxha. So another very important Slovak leader from the time period. And he's going to work with groups such as the National Slovak Society in the United States and the Slovak Evangelical Union in the United States. And again, they're pushing Czechoslovakia, but with Slovak autonomy. On the other side of the debate, then you have the Slovak autonomists who tend to be more for the Catholic organizations. So the Slovak League of America will largely fall with this faction at the time, but also so will the specifically Slovak Catholic organizations, such as the First Catholic Slovak Union. And their approach is to initially cooperate with the independent Slovak Republic, especially right after Munich. When Slovakia gains autonomy, they feel like this is the achievement of everything that they've been working for. Things get a little bit more dicey, though, when Hitler invades, Slovakia declares independence. The Slovak League initially will reaffirm its support for autonomy, but will oppose secession from Czechoslovakia. Although the Slovak president, you're probably familiar with him too, Josef Tiso, who was the leader of the World War II Slovak state, basically reached out to them, made a pitch for them to support Slovak independence. So the Slovak League will have a period where they will support the new state, independent Slovakia. Although this is going to put them under a lot of pressure, especially once World War II breaks out and the United States moves toward entering World War II, and then especially when after Pearl Harbor, when the U.S. does join the war. You're going to see the autonomists and the Slovak League really have to play a delicate balancing act. By this point, the Slovak League president is Francis Dubos. You see his picture here. And Dubos basically wants to push Slovak independence in terms of culture. They want to see an autonomous Slovakia, but they also want to work very hard not to be associated with Nazi Germany, which becomes very difficult when the Slovak Republic, by this point, has made a full alliance with Nazi Germany. And so they're going to come under a lot of accusations of treason, particularly the organization by Edvard Beneš will constantly pressure the federal government to investigate the Slovak League and other Slovak autonomous organizations. And so organizations such as the Dease Committee in Congress, the FBI, the State Department, the Office of War Information, these government agencies will all investigate the Slovak autonomous, and they will do both the Catholic groups, but also the moderates, like Milan Hoxha and his groups will also be investigated for based on accusations of treason. And ultimately, at least from my research, I found no evidence that there was any evidence of treason or support for fascism. Basically, they wanted Slovak independence. And they kind of liked the Slovak state because it proved, in their view, that Slovakia could be independent, that they could form their own government, that it wouldn't completely fall apart. Although officially, all of the Slovak organizations, once the U.S. enters the war, moves back to support for recreation of Czechoslovakia. And they basically kind of take the stance that, okay, we're going to stick with recreation of Czechoslovakia, but they want to push for autonomy. And you see this explicitly in 1943, where you're going to have a big meeting in Washington, D.C. This is the 25th Congress of the Slovak League. And this is a big moment where they basically line out their goals for the war. And so they say up front, we're supporting autonomy, but within a recreated Czechoslovakia, and otherwise push support for the American war effort. They say, look, we want to prove that we oppose fascism, and we're going to do it by supporting the United States in the war. And so they will condemn Hitler, they will condemn Nazi Germany's invasions of all the countries in Europe, and also in this organization, they will pledge their moral support for Jews in Europe. And so they will recognize that in effect, the Holocaust was taking place, and that as an organization, they oppose this. And this is just kind of like what's going to be their program during World War II. It's all about kind of like showing their support for the war effort. And so you see on your left, this is before the U.S. enters World War II, but in 1940, a group of the Slovak League will actually gain a meeting with President Roosevelt. And so they're really putting a lot of work, a lot of campaigning to kind of push their objective. Ultimately, what happens, though, is really, I think the wounds of World War II never really heal. After the war, Czechoslovakia will be recreated, but all the divides, all the acrimony, all the accusations of betrayal and treason on all sides that have been going on is going to make reconciliation very, very difficult. And it basically happens because the government of Edvard Beneš takes back over and basically follow through with their plan to shut down any talk of Slovak autonomy. And then this, of course, leads up to the 1948 communist coup. And what you end up happening is like kind of these moments just continue to be big fissures among the competing Slovak groups versus centralists, autonomous, and people on different parts of the spectrum, where you just constantly see in the accounts where the centralists constantly refer back to World War II and say that the autonomists are basically fascists and supported Nazis during the war. The autonomists then kind of respond with the countercharge, but for communism, saying that supporters of the Czechoslovak government had sold them out to Joseph Stalin and had set the stage for the communist coup. And this is where my book ends in 1948, basically because for practical reasons, because I had written a lot already, and I kind of needed this made a good stopping point, but also because it's also kind of like a cutting off point, because once the communists take over, the level of interchange between Czechoslovakia and immigrant communities in the United States was really, really circumcised. And so you still had the debates going on, but they were more separate. But the debates, the acrimony never really kind of quite goes away. And it's all going to kind of rear its head again after the Velvet Revolution, and all of these debates just kind of like get brought back to the surface in Czechoslovakia, and it ultimately leads to the splitting of the two countries in 1993. And okay, so I threw a lot at you. I'm kind of like trying to summarize an entire book here. I hope you found it interesting. The book obviously gets into a lot more detail than what I gave here, but I think I hit close to the 45-minute mark since we started a little bit late. So we should have plenty of time for questions, which I'm happy to ask. Or excuse me, happy for you to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Cude. We do have a couple of them in the chat. One was, will this be available in ebooks?
So as far as I'm aware, it should be available in ebook format. You may have to go through the publisher, which is University of Pittsburgh Press. And so I haven't checked lately whether it's ebook form on Amazon, but I know they did make an ebook version, and if you go to the website for the publisher, they should definitely have it available there.
All right, thank you. Okay, the other one is, there is a third factor, and there is the Karpato-Rusins. How did they factor in the Slovak identity during this time period?
Yeah, and so the Rusin, I don't get into too much detail in my book, mostly because of again trying to keep it. I had strict limits on how much I could include in terms of page limit for the publisher, and so they're a very similar situation to the Slovaks because they're kind of going through a lot of the same debates and arguments with the government in Czechoslovakia. And there's also the debates like, okay, like where do the Rusin end? Where do the Rusins start and the Slovaks end, and who qualifies for what? Very similar debates as what's going on between the Slovaks and the Czechs. They likewise have like a similar process. They have their own agreement that they made with the Czech government in exile. I believe off the top of my head, it was done in Philadelphia. So I think it's referred to as the Philadelphia Agreement. So it's very comparable. And of course, there's obviously still some Rusin in Eastern Slovakia today, although the majority of their regions got absorbed into the Soviet Union after World War II. So that's also kind of a difference in their situation.
Yeah.
But definitely an excellent question.
Oh, there's a couple more in here. Another one is, what was the role of the Slovak Evangelical Union compared with the SLA?
Um, so like the book gets a little bit more into the differences, and so I try to avoid getting too deep into the weeds for the sake of time, but this is really kind of a reflection of religious divides. So Slovak Protestants tended to be more supportive of the Czechoslovak Republic, and depending on who you look at, some of them are very much centralists, support full unification with the Czechs. Others are more moderates, where they want to cooperate with the Czechs, but also support some degree of autonomy with Slovakia. And in my research, I found the Lutheran communities were kind of divided between these two groups. But like during World War II, they were firmly behind the Hoxha faction in the debates during World War II. So they kind of like consolidated around his leadership at that time. The Catholics tend to be, generally speaking, more autonomous, and then secular Slovaks and Jewish Slovaks tend to be more centralist in their approach. So that goes a little bit beyond the specific question about the SEU, but
It's all right. There's another one in the chat, and then we'll open the floor for other people. What percentage of Slovak Americans backed autonomy versus those who backed Prague centralism? Was it not more a religious divide, or Catholic versus some Protestants and secularists?
like religion is a big part of the divide, as I just explained. Like putting percentages is very difficult because we just do not have any like we don't like have a clear census where people just, or a poll where people just sign where they fit. So I have a few accounts like from documents where different organizations tried to figure this out for themselves. They weren't like scientific polls or of anything, but basically, if you just look at the population growth, because the majority of Slovaks are Catholic, the autonomous faction definitely has the most support. And part of that is just raw numbers because of Catholics are the majority among the Slovaks, but also when you include like some Protestants were also autonomous, and even some, even like if you get into the weeds of like the socialist movement of the Slovaks in America, they also have some socialists who are autonomous too. And so autonomous definitely make up the largest group. I just could not give you exact percentages, and I give some estimates in the book, and so.
Yeah, Michael's writing into the chat that about 70% of Slovaks were Catholic, so this might be a clue. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, there's nothing in the chat. Does anybody want to open the microphone and ask questions? We still have time, Michael, right?
Oh yeah, I'm good. So I'm happy to answer.
Yeah,
answer
not everybody
not
everybody can type, so they can open their mics and ask.
Sure.
If there's anybody there. Nobody? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Martha, I'd just like to make a comment that
Yes, Ken.
this is, I found this, very interesting, and bless you for engaging this topic, because
Thank
I
you,
think
Helen.
it is a very interesting, one, and I look forward to reading your book.
Yeah.
So, but I will read it, and then maybe I'll have other questions. But
Okay.
I very much enjoyed the talk, and I think it's a very, important topic for Slovak Americans
Yeah.
to engage. I haven't seen as much in terms of a deep dive on this topic specifically over
Yeah, and
time.
I'm sure Michael
And
will continue going from 1948
that's
to
what I was going to ask.
present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you plan to move on, because then I think it would be very interesting to see during the communist period
Yeah.
a lot of what went on in the USA and how this debate played out
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
time. So
Yeah, and so I do have a so it's a chapter in a collected work. So it's a book on immigrant and exile communities from the Cold War, and I wrote the chapter on Czechoslovakia, and so that's just an article, so it doesn't get into the level of detail as my book does, but that is available if you could potentially find that book um, in short term. But yeah, definitely more work needs to be done, and like I think my original plan was to go all the way up to through the end of the Cold War and actual independence. It just kind of got too much, so I had to stop for the sake of being able to finish. And so I definitely I've done a little bit of work on that, and that's available. But more work definitely needs to be done. And otherwise, Ken, thank you for your comments. And I think, yeah, for Slovak Americans, I think it's a great topic because it shows how influential and how much that they did actually shaped what was happening in Czechoslovakia, and that there was all this engagement. And and I think especially now, we're now at like multiple generations, and
Yeah. There's a couple of extra comments from my colleagues. One of the problems in World War II was that Slovakia declared war on the USA to appease Hitler, which put Slovak Americans to choose sides.
Yeah, and I mean, even just this topic of the declaration of war is a disputed topic, because there are going to be arguments made that Slovakia did not actually declare war on the United States, because basically what happens if you get into the weeds on this, and this is actually addressed in the book, so you can get a lot more detail in the book, but you literally have one official declare war on the United States, and then you have Tiso, the president, basically denying it, saying that it's not legitimate, it doesn't represent the government, and basically saying they've declared war on the Soviet Union, but not the United States. And when he makes this argument, he actually says the reason they don't is because of the Slovak Americans. They say, we have a friendship with the United States. We don't want, and so the U.S. State Department in the buildup to the trial of Joseph Tiso after the war actually debates this quite a bit. They do a lot of research to try to figure out, okay, did Slovakia actually declare war on the United States? And even they don't really come to a clear conclusion, because you just have different politicians did different things. And so, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of more comments. Can't wait to read your book. I know my parents spoke about the influence of Slovak Americans in the state of Slovakia. Now I see it. That's from Veronica. And then Helen, what was the level and type of financial support by Slovak Americans for the Slovak part of the two Czechoslovak republics?
Yeah, so I again I do not have numbers to throw at you at the top of my head.
I think
I
we
will
need to buy a book.
Yeah. And even then, it's difficult because we don't have, again, we don't have like clear records of everything that was sent and collected. I know, especially before World War One, there was lots and lots of resources collected during that phase. World War Two, it became a lot more tricky because there are a lot more cut off. And so during World War Two, most of the fundraising went toward domestic efforts in the United States, like war bond campaigns and things like that. And the interwar period, I think it's so far spread out, and I just never really found clear accounting for that. And so that the actual volume of financial support, I just could not tell you for especially for the period in between the two world wars. But I do know we're talking about millions of dollars during World War One and millions during World War Two, again, with World War Two mostly going or staying in the United States.
Yeah, and then Michael Kopanic has a comment. Milan Štefánik claimed that Beneš absconded Slovak American donations and gambled them in Monaco.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's lots of these types of accusations, and at least from my research, like no real evidence of these types of things, but who knows?
Yeah, you never know exactly. Yeah. Whatever went behind doors, nobody will know.
Yeah, but there were definitely lots of accusations of money being wasted during World War I.
Yeah. So. Well, that's all. Oh, Renata has a question.
Yes, hello. I prefer to ask the question rather than to
type. Much better, yeah.
So my name is Renata Kamenarová, and I'm director of the Slovak program, Slovak Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh. So I'm definitely excited. I was excited, and I'm still excited about your lecture, Michael. And I hope we can discuss if you want to stay on Zoom. I have several questions, but for this larger audience, I would like to ask you if you in your research found any evidence that Professor Masaryk was planning also to add sorbs from Germany, Slavic nations, upper and lower sorbs, to be part. They wanted definitely to be part of the first Czechoslovak Republic. And then other thing, you nicely explained, differences between centralists and autonomists, but I would like to hear more about the theory of Czechoslovaks as one nation, which was the theory that Masaryk, as a professor, started. And it's also important to mention that in the first Czechoslovak Republic, there were many Germans. And without this theory, Germans would be second most popular nation.
Yeah.
Germans and Slovaks would be third. So it was kind of also practical, and Masaryk always explained it this way, right? Like kind of wanting Slovaks to be part of the majority in the country, otherwise they would be number three, and then maybe Hungarians, Carpathorusins, and then technically also they wanted Serbs. So I have kind of these two questions.
Yeah, and so I unfortunately I'm very much not an expert on the situation of the Sorbian population. I know it was brought up like at Versailles during the debates, and I think really a lot of the issues really just kind of came down to I think they're, let me go back to the map of toward Czechoslovakia. And so I think a lot of it really just kind of came down to the geography. And so as you're probably familiar, the debates at Versailles really got very granular about, okay, who's where, who's going to be included. And in many ways, the Sorbian population was a way to kind of, at Versailles, for the big four leaders to say, well, we're leaving all these Germans in Czechoslovakia, but see, look here, there's a population of Slavs that got left in Germany, and so not everybody is getting a raw deal sort of thing. Like everyone's going to have to take a little bit of medicine and not get kind of like their ideal situation. In terms of the Czechoslovak identity, so very difficult to explain in a short answer, but I mean, as you're probably aware, with a lot of the national identity formation, that there's lots of debates. It's all contested, but ultimately goes back to the idea that ultimately that they were a common people with common roots, particularly from Great Moravia, but then that the Germans and the Hungarians had come in and kind of forcibly split them apart and kind of put pressure on each one, and that the reunification of the two people was kind of like bringing together a historical reunification after they had been split in the early modern period with the creation of Austria-Hungary. And like you said, some of it just came down to raw numbers, and it was because the Czechs were technically a minority majority. They were the largest population, but they were less than 50% on their own. And so by including the Slovaks and categorizing them as Czechoslovaks, it did allow them to say that, okay, this is a majority nation state. Because like Renata, the Sudeten Germans were the second largest population in Czechoslovakia if you keep the Czechs and the Slovaks separate.
Yeah, and then when the whole theory of Czechoslovakism was even problematic when I studied linguistics, and often
right,
not linguists, but Czech students would often say, hey, Slovak is just the dialect of
right
language, so we of course don't like that. And I studied linguistics, and I taught also historical grammar, and I always say and encourage everyone to say the same. In 10th century, we dated back to 10th century. Clearly, linguistic changes happened that separated these languages. At the same time, when from Proto-Slavic, there were distinguished Polish, Czech, Sorbian, Slovak. It happened kind of at the same time. So these are two different languages having same background. But I understand both sides, and it's very interesting to look at everyone's motivations. And also you mentioned Beneš criticizing Hoxha, even though Hoxha was a centralist. A couple of weeks ago, we had a lecture of Professor Palka, who is the grandson of Hoxha. And he also said, like, they were rivals. You have to also add that personal level there, that Beneš couldn't stand Hoxha, and personal rivals for the high position in a state. So there are a lot going on. Yeah, you explain it very, very nicely. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Renata. I appreciate that. Yeah. It gets really tough when you get into the weeds of all the personality conflicts. Because, it's
exactly. So thank you, Renata, for that question. Anybody else has any questions before we depart for the afternoon? All right. Well, thank you, Michael Cude, for the great talk today.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure, Marta. And
no problem.
If anyone wants to follow up or has follow-up questions, if you Google me, you can find my university website and get my email. And I'm happy to follow up with discussions.
Or send us an email and we'll forward it.
Well, sure. Yeah, definitely. I can do that too.
So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully see you at our next event virtually or in person. Our picnic's coming up in a couple of weeks, but that's in Virginia. I wish Michael could make it. All right. So thank you, everyone. If you